have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
September 11, 2001. It was one of the darkest days in US history. Chaos and fear.
Still around, guys, still around.
God bless you.
We'll make it.
Nearly 3,000 people were killed and thousands more were injured. The perpetrators were from the Middle East.
We're tracking down terrorists who hate America, one by one. We're on the hunt. We got them on the run. And it's a matter of time before they learn the meaning of American justice.
Ibrahim Abdul-Metin was born and raised in Brooklyn. He's also a practicing Muslim. He says when he was younger, people in his neighborhood were kind to each other, regardless of race and religion. But he says he realized that was going to change when he saw on TV that the hijackers were Muslims. Abdul-Metin says a sudden change of mood was palpable in New York City.
I looked at the plane and I was like, is that hitting the World Trade Center? Like there was like this surge of like excitement, wonder, nervousness, fear. It was just like rushing through my body. And my first thought was, I hope it wasn't a black man. And then I started listening to the coverage a little bit, and I was like, well, this is be a bad time to be someone, to just be out and about. They're gonna be looking for people that are connected to this.
In the months after the attacks, hate crimes against Muslims were at the highest level in America's history. The hijackers were Muslims and said they were acting in the name of Islam. Despite the fact that much of the community rejected that interpretation of Islam, it was enough for the members of the media, government and public to demonize American Muslims.
There was a sense that people were going to be under attack, like that Muslims had to be careful. So people were telling folks, don't wear a hijab, you know, if you have a beard, cut your beard, you know, don't wear a thobe, you know, like just to be mindful and be careful. We'll get through this in time. We just have to sort of deal with it and assimilate. You know, you have to, you know, blend in, change your name. Don't be Muhammad, be Mo, right? Don't be Ibrahim, be Ib or Ibbi. Don't be Samir, be Sami.
Eventually, the US government started to make policy changes to match rising public anti-Muslim sentiment. Those policies would become part of the so-called War on Terror.
Islamophobia is built on this idea that hate and fear of Muslims stems from the idea that Muslim identity, expression of Muslim identity, is correlative with the possibility of terrorism, suspicion of terrorism.
Khalid Beydoun is an associate professor of law at the University of Detroit. He's also a Lebanese American and is the author of American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and the Rise of Fear. Khalid says Muslims were unwelcomed immigrants and foreigners before 9/11, but after, they were cast as a demographic threat to national security.
Post 9/11, the United States government, the executive branch, the legislature, But also the judiciary was very invested in sort of, constructing a new architecture, a new legal and institutional architecture that was committed entirely to police Muslim Americans and Muslim life in the States.
Just 6 weeks after the terror attacks, Congress passed the Patriot Act, and former President George W. Bush signed it into law. It expanded the government's ability to surveil Americans, broadened the definition of terrorism, and allowed for immigrants to be detained without trial indefinitely. And though many legal experts consider it unconstitutional, it soon became the cornerstone of efforts to police Muslims in the United States.
The Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was new legislation that enabled the federal government, the FBI specifically, to spy on Muslims in ways that were unprecedented before. They could do so without warrants.
After the Patriot Act was passed, the government allowed law enforcement to detain, arrest, and deport thousands of Muslims in the wake of September 11. But the Patriot Act was far from the only tool Washington used to crack down on the Muslim community.
The National Security Exit and Entry Registration System, which was very much a Muslim registry. Remember, Trump called, he said he wanted to install a Muslim registry. Well, guess what, Trump? It was in place before you came to office under the Bush administration and the Obama administration.
The system, which has since been dismantled, was designed by the Department of Homeland Security. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, it targeted nationals of 25 countries based on religion, ethnicity, and national origin. Nearly 3,000 people were detained under the scheme, most of them Muslims. Within 2 years, more than 13,000 people were placed in deportation proceedings. In the name of community outreach, law enforcement recruited paid and unpaid informants to create demographic profiles of neighborhoods, including the location of mosques and beliefs of their congregants.
Countering violent extremism program, Counter-Radicalization. And the way that Counter-Radicalization worked under the Obama campaign was the FBI worked closely with law enforcement. So the FBI developed relationships with the NYPD, with the Detroit Police Department, the LAPD, so on and so forth. Then law enforcement would then work to build relationships with members within the Muslim community, especially prominent members of the Muslim community.
Although a Republican president launched the so-called War on Terror, Bush's Democratic successor carried on many of his policies and in some cases took an even harder line.
Now, Obama had spent millions and millions of dollars giving Muslim organizations willing to work with him to develop informants grant money, and millions of dollars bolstering law enforcement to work closely with the Obama administration to develop this new surveillance program, which in my opinion in many ways was more destructive on Muslim life and Muslim civil liberties than the policies that I had mentioned beforehand that are associated with the Bush administration, and even the policies that Trump established after Obama's 2 terms were over.
During the Obama administration, the FBI has denied conducting surveillance based solely on ethnicity and sending paid informants into mosques. But in a budget request from 2008, before Obama took office, the Bureau revealed that at the time it already had more than 15,000 informants.
People will say this is not a war on Islam or Muslims. It's a weird thing to kind of rebut because most of those who are impacted, right, who are being targeted are Muslim. So to me, the question is, what difference does it make if it's not a war on Islam, but it's a war on the adherents of Islam? And can you really actually convince people that that's not the case when the vast majority of people being targeted and impacted are Muslim?
Maha Hilal is a researcher and writer focused on institutionalized Islamophobia and the war on terror. She lives in Washington, D.C., but we caught up with her in Wisconsin. Hilal says post 9/11, the US government decided the Muslim community had a radicalization problem, and she says they held Muslims collectively responsible for it.
The idea that the problem of radicalization was imposed on the Muslim American community. There was this idea that we're imposing this radicalization on you. We're telling you you have a problem, but don't worry, we're going to work on it together, even though statistically you don't have it, but we're telling you you have it.
Washington argued that Al-Qaeda would try to recruit and radicalize US Muslims, to fundraise for them, and eventually to conduct another major attack. But the fear of homegrown terrorism led federal agencies to treat Muslims as uniquely susceptible to terrorist propaganda. But they used this as justification to subject them to heightened government scrutiny. But according to a survey by Pew Research Center, majority of Muslims reject extremism and see violence as discordant with their values. But Hilal says the problem is the government's perception of Muslims.
So I think in order to really begin to address this problem, the US actually has to deconstruct this idea that Muslims are just inherently rageful, right? And Muslims always disproportionately respond to violence and oppression in a way that's just so different and exceptional from other groups.
Hilal says the war on terror has multiple fronts and targets Muslims not only in the US, but around the world.
Whoever holds the leadership position at any given time can shift the tide a little bit here and there. But fundamentally, there's a structural issue, right? When we think about US government and the policies and laws it designs and implements and the massive amounts of state violence that is committed domestically and abroad.
A prime example is the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center on the island of Cuba. The longtime US naval base was converted into a military prison in 2002. And it has become a symbol of injustice and torture.
And a lot of the ways they built up evidence was to torture those in detention into confessing whatever it is they wanted them to confess for the purposes of charging them. If you wanted credible information, you wouldn't be torturing them. You would be trying to establish rapport, right? You would try to talk to them. You would provide them with humane conditions, right? So really it was just to torture people. And when you torture people, normally in the US legal system, right, that evidence is excluded from their case, right? You cannot torture someone into confessing something and use that in a normal US court.
Many, including the former CIA Deputy Director of Operations James Pavitt, said the public revelation of the detention of interrogation program is its worst nightmare, and tried to justify the necessity of torture in order to prevent further attacks. Terrorism suspects can be held in Guantanamo without any official charges against them. Nearly 800 people have been detained there over the last 2 decades. At least 9 prisoners have died in detention and 3 were confirmed suicides. Today, 39 detainees still remain in Guantanamo's dark cells. And the war on terror has reached the other side of the Atlantic as a result of cooperation from US allies.
I remember entering our apartment and the FBI had gone through all of our belongings, including everything in my bedroom. And so, items were disheveled, pictures were confiscated, books, home videos. It was just a complete mess. And I remember coming into the apartment and my dad was sitting with the attorney, with our family attorney, and it was honestly just it was terrifying.
Maryam Abu Ali is an American Muslim and does civil rights work in Michigan. Her brother is Ahmed Omar Abu Ali. He's been serving a life sentence in the US on terrorism charges. Maryam says Ahmed was a very successful and bright student, but that his passion for Islamic studies made him a target. In 2003, Ahmed was detained in Saudi Arabia by Mabahith, the Saudi secret police. He was accused of being linked to Al-Qaeda and was held in detention for 47 days.
After that, they presented him with a written confession that they wanted him to read. And he pretty much was forced to read this confession on videotape, which they could have used if they truly believed that he was guilty, if they truly believed that he was a terrorist, then, why didn't they bring him back?
Thanks to his family's efforts, Ahmed was finally sent back to the US. But the accusations against Ahmed remained. US prosecutors accused him of trying to establish an Al-Qaeda cell, similar to the one that carried out the September 11 attack, and of conspiring to assassinate former President Bush.
Post 9/11, it was an easy way to convict people in the war on terror, just to showcase that, here we are fighting terrorism, and look at all these terrorists that we've caught.
But Ahmed's family insists the only tangible evidence against him was a videotaped confession. They believe it was obtained under coercion in Saudi Arabia. And despite his requests, Ahmed was not allowed to show the courtroom what he said were scars from the torture.
The judge did not allow him to do that, and he said he would have the opportunity to do so at a later time, which never happened, by the way. The U.S. prosecution heavily argued against the fact that he was tortured. They completely denied it.
The US government rejected the torture accusations based on testimony from Saudi intelligence officials said Ahmed was given 5-star treatment.
Pretty much the crux of the case was this confession tape that they had recorded in Saudi Arabia. That was the evidence that was used against him to convict him. And we argued in court that, this evidence was obtained under torture. It was obtained in a country that is known for torturing their detainees and their prisoners. Even the U.S. State Department's statements on the human rights record of Saudi Arabia states that torture is rampant in Saudi prisons, and it's just a part of their normal procedure.
And after he was convicted in the US, Ahmed was kept in solitary confinement from 2005 to 2018. Amnesty International has accused the maximum security prison where he was held of inhumane treatment of its prisoners.
He was held in solitary confinement. His communication with the outside world was severely limited. He wasn't allowed access to the press. He couldn't talk to reporters. He was not allowed to talk to anybody except immediate family. And even then, communication was very limited. He had 2 15-minute phone calls a month that were unplanned or unscheduled.
The government also used the pretext of the war on terror to target community leaders and activists.
I lived in the United States for 40 years. I came when I was 17. I was born as a Palestinian refugee who really had no rights, even in the countries that I grew up in. But there, I was given the opportunities. I was able to finish my education. I was able to find a job at the university and be whoever I wanted to be. I was free to talk.
Sami Allarian is a well-known civil rights activist and computer science professor. He's been living in Turkey since the US deported him in 2015. For decades, he'd been a champion of civil rights and a critic of US policies until 2003, when he was charged for being a leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad based on his speeches, lectures, books he wrote before 9/11. Allarian spent 5.5 years in prison before admitting to one of the remaining charges as part of a plea bargain.
And then the alternative was either a new trial or I give up my rights in the United States and leave, which I opted to. Would have been the easier way because I didn't have another $1 million to pay the attorneys.
But he had to remain on house arrest until 2014, after he refused to testify before a grand jury in a separate case, admitting his so-called material support to terrorism. That's when federal prosecutors filed a motion to dismiss charges against him. According to Allarian, the US government has misunderstood the root cause of the attack. The US government think it was terrorism, but he thinks it was the US policies that led to 9/11.
What happened 9/11 was because, these people did it, and it's criminal, no doubt, but it wasn't because of Islam. It was because of US policies. So, but they don't want to, the people don't want to ask the question, why did it happen? Was it because of they hated us because of who we are, or did they hate us because of our policies? Because if they said that they hated us because of who we are, and that's basically what they said, then then we're going to give it to them and we're going to go after them, and that means that every Muslim became a target.
Allarian says the war on terror has been far from successful for the US. From Allarian's decades of activism, including his advocacy for former President George W. Bush, the academic says if 9/11 taught Muslims one thing, it is to stand together.
One of the most important lessons that we learned from this ordeal is that when we were united, when we were more determined to fight government repression, government violations of civil and constitutional rights, we were able to assert ourselves and actually gain. We have to stand up actually and bring them to their senses that these are the ideals that they espouse and then they need to uphold, and what they've done to the Muslim community, not just in the United States, but around the world, is simply to violate many of these principles and many of these ideals because of what happened on 9/11. What happened on 9/11 had nothing to do with Islam, and they know that.
Exactly 20 years ago today, the United States of America and the world entered a new era. The hijackers and victims are gone, but the effects of the September 11 attack have changed the lives of entire communities. For many, it inflicted wounds that will never heal, regardless of religion and race. For others, the so-called war on terror has been a lesson in how division can quickly become destructive. Since 2001, the Muslim community has developed its own defense mechanisms against discrimination and repression. Community leaders say many Muslim Americans have rallied around political representation, activism, better education, and finding a stronger voice in American politics.